we can make improvement, we can work harder to make these scenes safer. And the very first statistic up there, or the very first call out there, on the scene of a crash, 6 of the 17 fatalities were officers working the scene of a crash, investigating it, getting driver information, setting up cones, whatever it may be. 6 law enforcement officers were struck and killed while working the scene of a crash, often with lots of emergency equipment out there.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Lifeline, offering a holistic wellness approach focused on supporting American law enforcement, promoting resilience, safety, and survivability.
Welcome to our fourth quarter webinar here at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, along with our partners from NHTSA. Today, as always, we'll hear from Rio Nelson briefly. Rio is a traffic safety specialist with the Justice and Enforcement Division of NHTSA. We'll hear from Rio, and then I'm going to get into a lot of detail from all the research that we've done with all the data we got from 2024. And that's going to include a lot of different pieces. I'll try not to make it so much like we're drinking from the fire hose, but I do have a lot of details that I've pulled out and extracted from my analysis of the crashes, and I think it's worthwhile information. So before I get into that, let me introduce Rio and see what he has for us today.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. And always, like I said before, Nick, on behalf of DOT and NHTSA, we always are appreciative of the work that you all do at the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund, the work that you guys do. And was really grateful for the partnership there. I don't have a lot of updates from our side. The numbers are still coming in and they're being finalized. So our next webinar will have some more numbers to present. But that's all I have. But thank you again for the hard work that you guys do. And I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Rio. So as always, I usually try and do 3 things, which is tell you a little about the Memorial Fund and then tell you about some of the other programs. I'm not going to really get into a lot of that today. I'm going to just touch on a couple of things, and then we're going to get into the data. I've tried to sort of upgrade the presentation a little bit. One thing I do want to say from the outset, though, ask questions, put them in the chat. If there's something else that I said or that you want more information on or that you have a comment on or whatever it is, please put it in there. I'll try and react to it. But of course, as we go through, make sure if you have questions, put them in there. And at the end, if there are questions, I'll try and address each one of the questions. And before I forget, we do have updated flash drives, and we gave those out at IACP in Boston. That was the first section where we actually gave out the new flash drives. It has a new video on it, which I'm going to touch on a little bit. And so anybody who would like 1 or 2 of those flash drives for their agencies, I've already mailed out a couple this week. Let me know, put it into the chat, or send me an email with your address so I know where to send it to, and we'll get those right out to you. So here we are today. It's January 16th. This is not exactly what it looks like outside, but it's very cold here in Washington, D.C. It's a nice shot of the memorial. The reason I put this up here is just to remind everybody what it is we do here. Our research team is actively working on finalizing all of the 2024 cases that will be added to the wall. The names will be read in May, but most of the engraving starts in late April. And they are working diligently to add not only this year's in the line of duty cases, but the historic cases that keep coming in. And I'll remind you as well that sometimes we get latent cases. There is one in traffic fatalities this year that's a case that started in 1987. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that case as well. But we'll be adding more names to the wall this spring, and our research team is working hard to get those done as soon as possible. One note on what we're adding to the wall: the Memorial Fund is also now has prepared a criteria for suicides. This is something that stemmed from a new rule change at the Public Safety Officers Benefits Program, as well as the upswell of concern for the tremendous problem of suicide in law enforcement. So the Memorial Fund now has a criteria, and you can go on our website. You can download what the criteria says for us to include it, as well as there's a new form that you have to fill out. So here's a shot of the museum. This is the pavilion that you would enter through if you visited us here in the museum. I'm in the museum here today, as I'm sure you've already figured out. So the museum is open. We have a large number of law enforcement officers here in Washington now because the inauguration is on Monday. And we always have extra agencies coming to support the Metropolitan Police Department and the U.S. Capitol Police in managing the inauguration. I was a Metropolitan Police officer for 26 years and was involved in I can't even count how many inaugurals I was in. So hopefully we're going to get a lot of visitorship to the museum and the memorial this week with all these officers in town, should they get a chance. They're pretty busy with training and getting ready for Monday. Last thing I'll do before we get into the numbers is I mentioned suicide already. There is the Safe Leo program. We are partners. The Memorial Fund is partners in this program. It stands for Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement. And it is a program run through the Bureau of Justice Assistance through DOJ. It is free. They will send instructors out to address the issues involved in suicide, to give you tools. And it has several phases. So you start with the executive leadership, then you can go down to the first line supervisors, give them what they need to know, and then go straight down to the line officers. The training is very good and can be very effective. And sometimes I am one of the trainers for Safe Leo as well. Sometimes those training sessions can be quite intense. Very valuable training. You can go on their website, safeleo.org, and find out where the trainings that are coming to you, where those are. Destination Zero, I've talked about this program before. It's the National Officer Safety and Wellness Awards. It is a clearinghouse for great ideas for all the different things that are involved in officer safety and wellness. To this group, I would put out, we always need submissions for officer traffic safety, not traffic enforcement and civilian traffic safety and roadway safety, officer traffic safety. If you remember, I think it was a year ago, we had Captain Peter Simbal from the Chesterfield, Virginia Police Department, who gave a great presentation on all the steps his agency is taking to protect their officers. And that's everything from lighting, visibility vests, adjustments to vehicles, training, and the like. And so we're always interested in hearing about agencies that are really addressing the issue of officer traffic safety, driver's training, policy, and all that kind of stuff. And then the last one there is NHTSA, and that brings us to where we are today. So here's how we ended 2024 compared to 2023. We had 147 line of duty deaths this year. 452 of them were firearms related. You can see percentage increases in all the categories all the way across the board this year for a 25% increase. And I have to make a note now because I'm going to reference our annual report that the Memorial Fund puts out, but I want you to pay attention to the asterisks next to 48. There's a reason that there's an asterisk there from my numbers that I share with you compared to the official numbers that we put out here at the Memorial Fund, and I'll explain that in a second. But by my calculation, with the cases I count, we have a 55% increase in traffic-related fatalities from 2023. So to me, that's a huge increase. So we did put out our end-of-year law enforcement officers fatalities reports. This covers everything from firearms to traffic to the category, which is other, which deals with everything from 9/11 related illnesses to officers who were in helicopter crashes or who drowned. Any of those other lesser included causes or manners of death that happen, but happen infrequently and aren't part of the two main categories, which are firearms and traffic. So if you're interested in that report, you go to our website, which was nleomf.org, right here at the top. If you can see my cursor, you at the top of the navigation bar, click on the memorial or hover over it, and then you'll see facts and figures drops down, and right under that is latest fatality reports. So you should be able to get to that report. So let's look at the traffic-related incidents for 2024. There are 27 automobile crashes. 6 of those 27 were single vehicle crashes. You know, I always call those out. Those are preventable crashes, largely the result of a driving error by an officer, speed, overcorrection, failing to negotiate a curve, or distraction. We've had 17 struck by crashes, which is, as I'm sure you know, is higher than it was last year, and 4 motorcycle crashes. So we break it down, let everybody know what types of agencies these crashes are happening. We do that just to give everybody a general idea and remind everybody that there are a large number of different types of law enforcement agencies in the United States. Each of them have their own training regimens, their own requirements, and their own duties. 16 of the fatalities were from municipal agencies, that being a city or large county or township agency. 14 were in sheriff's agencies, 13 were in state, 1 federal, 1 territorial. There were 2 constables. I think they're both out of Texas. No, correction. 1 was a Pennsylvania constable and 1 was a Texas constable, and 1 tribal line of duty death. So as we look in 2024 at the fatal automobile crashes, we're not talking about struck bys. We're talking about the automobile crashes. The most common circumstance in those crashes, what the officers were doing when they were driving, was responding to a call for service. 4 of the crashes involved an officer on an assignment, an admin assignment, or going to and from work in their marked patrol car. 2 of the crashes involved officers who were parked on a shoulder. 2 involved officers who were on traffic stops and struck while on traffic in their vehicles, but struck on traffic stops. 1 was an officer was on an investigative assignment. 1 was transporting an arrestee. I may talk about that in a minute. 1 was on patrol. 1 was parked at a crash scene, and 1 was using his vehicle to divert traffic. These are all vehicle crashes in 2024. So if we get a larger picture, I think the last time I showed it to you, we had a 12-year comparison. This gives you an idea as to where we are each year, with a high of 36 and a low of 22, which was last year, kind of the range that we are in traffic automobile crashes, right? Automobile crashes. So there were 27 fatal automobile crashes in 2024. And I guess as you look at these numbers, that's pretty much on average or close to average. So the types of crashes that we saw in automobile crashes, 5 were at intersections. 1 involved a sideswipe crash. 5 were head-on. 6 involved officers, and those are your single vehicle crashes, who lost control of their vehicle and hit an abutment, hit a tree, hit a utility pole, or rolled over and crashed. 6 involved a car being rear-ended, and those were in different scenarios from the circumstances I just gave you. And 2 rear-ended other vehicles. And this year, I started looking at least tracking cases that involved what I will call officer error. In other words, the final crash report, as well as all the evidence, indicates that that officer, unfortunately, committed some part or contributed in some way to that crash. And that's something I think we need to pay attention to. So the vehicle crash data, and I said I was talking about officer error contributing. 12 of the crashes involved just a direct driving error by an officer. We had 3 cases that were head-on crashes where the officer actually was the vehicle that went over the double yellow line, crashing into an oncoming vehicle. We had 6 that lost control, and another one that rear-ended a car. So these are actually there were 2 that rear-ended a car. So these are some of the factors that we see where officers are distracted, or they're going too fast, or there's something going on in the car to where they've lost control. The most common circumstance is officers responding to a call for service, a priority call for service. And again, I mentioned 6 of the vehicle crashes were single vehicle crashes. As we look at the 6 single vehicle crashes, 3 involved pursuits. 2 were directly involved in pursuit, and 1 was trying to catch up to a pursuit. 1 was on an administrative run, and one was transporting an arrestee. And this is one of the cases I told you I put an asterisk next to that 48. The reason there's an asterisk next to that 48 is because this case, the individual in this case transporting the arrestee drove into a river off of a boat ramp. It was a new deputy who was lost and drove off of the boat ramp rather than, I think the deputy thought he was on one road that paralleled this road. He was a newer deputy to the area and he drove off the boat ramp, unfortunately, with an arrestee in the back, and they both drowned. The way the Memorial Fund records our primary reason, it is the primary cause of death, it's drowning. So he was not counted in the traffic statistics. He was put under the other category of drowning. That's kind of the way we do things here. I take that because there's a traffic component and I add it to my numbers so everybody will understand that it's not even really a big discrepancy. It's just me drawing out the fact that there was a traffic element involved in this case. The other one who crashed was responding to a call for service. If any of you remember Melanie Fowler from the CDC NIOSH, who is a fatal accident investigator, she's presented, at a couple of our summits and at some of our traffic safety presentations. She is doing a study on seatbelt usage. Please take a second and write down that email to share with your officers. I know many of you are law enforcement liaisons, to have them volunteer to simply contact Melanie and participate in this brief interview about seatbelt use in law enforcement. It's anonymous. If you're retired, they'll do it. If you're current, she'll take your information. But I think we really want to hear from current serving law enforcement officers to just simply send an email to Melanie M. Stefani at mix.wvu.edu and have them assist her by just participating in the interview. No fuss, no muss. So the next big category, we've talked about crashes and we talked about the subcategory of single vehicle crashes. Let's look at struck by crashes. And this again is one of our major concerns that I think we can have improvement. We can make improvement. We can work harder to make these scenes safer. And the very first statistic up there, or the very first call out there, on the scene of a crash, 6 of the 17 fatalities were officers working the scene of a crash, investigating it, getting driver information, setting up cones, whatever it may be. 6 law enforcement officers were struck and killed while working the scene of a crash, often with lots of emergency equipment out there, lots of flashing lights. To me, it's inexplicable that people don't see this and seem to drive through. I know in one case, they've already documented a guy was watching a movie on his phone and drove right into the crash scene, killing somebody. You know, it shocks me. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't shock people anymore. 4 were on traffic stops when they were struck. And then on the shoulder, disabled speed enforcement. I'm going to talk about that. That was a big struck by that happened in November. Very sad. I'm going to go back and talk about that. 1 was using a tire deflation device. We've focused on tire deflation devices, and that's much lower than it was last year. We had 4 from 2023 who were struck and killed deploying stop sticks, tire deflation devices, spike strips, whatever you want to call them. 1 was attempting an arrest. And what that means is that he was getting out of his car after the bailout to pursue somebody. And unfortunately, that officer was struck and killed by a fellow officer who was also responding as the pursuit ended and there was a bailout. So it's a sort of a sad situation there. 1 officer was standing out directing traffic away from an event. And then the last one there, which just happened, that was the last case of the year, a state patrol officer was struck and killed while he was removing debris from the roadway. So again, I gave you that sort of wide view of crashes and what it looks like over the years. Here's where we are in terms of struck by crashes. And we're up from last year. And I need to change the date up there. But this is where we are for the struck by crashes and gives you an idea, again, kind of where we stay. And 27 was a huge outlier, which prompted us to take some actions and hold the summit and begin to really even look harder at the problem. I thought we were seeing success. Now we've gone back up. And 7 cases, to me, that's a lot. I know these are small numbers, And they may be technically, in terms of the number of law enforcement officers who serve, these are probably statistically insignificant numbers, but they're significant to us here at the Memorial Fund, and they're certainly significant to all the agencies that have officers struck and killed. And why a 7-person increase or 7-case increase may not seem like much, it's actually quite large for what we're measuring. So I mentioned 3 struck bys. If you were not aware of this, we lost 3 motor officers from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office in Florida in one incident. And it really ties into distraction and slow down and move over. The quote from the report, which we just got in and I reviewed, D1 swerved to avoid a vehicle that had suddenly slowed in front of her, right? Okay. The reason the vehicle ahead of her was slowing is because that driver saw the deputies on the right-hand side of the road. It's a 2-lane road. It's straight. The report said the driver striking D1, striking vehicle, had no visual obstructions, meaning that driver should have seen them on the right-hand side of the road, on the shoulder, actually even further off the shoulder. And if you're going to say it's not distraction, of course it's distraction, because the vehicle that slowed was slowing to obey the law and doing the right thing. And all of a sudden, this driver who's not paying attention comes up upon that car and swerves to avoid that car, which is obeying the law and slowing down, and wipes out 3 officers. And it's terrible. I mean, this is huge for this agency. And it's very rare that we have these multiple cases, but I wanted to highlight it because it is emblematic of the problems that are going on in our roadways, where officers are being struck and killed in these incidents, which are, I mean, obviously they're inexcusable, but we've got to figure out how to do better to keep people's eyes on the road and off of their phones or whatever it is they're on. This is a very, very sad case. So speaking of slow down and move over, 16 of the crashes, vehicles and struck by crashes, I examined and realized that those were the result of a violation of that state's slow down and move over law. So it is a significant percentage of the crashes that were involved that involved a slow down and move over violation. I thought I had that number, that percentage right in front of me, but I don't have it. Anyway, so that's out of 48 deaths, 16 we can connect to violations of the slow down and move over law. So if you remember our friends at ERSI, Emergency Responder Safety Institute, I also show their numbers. This is their final report as of December 31st, 2024. A total of 34 responders have been killed. I think I need to update that number. There are 26 law enforcement officers, and I'd remind you again, crossing guards, reserves, and auxiliary. Those are things that we in the Memorial Fund, who are not, if they're not sworn, we don't count them, but we still look at those cases. But for us to count them officially, they have to be sworn law enforcement officers. 12 towing and recovery, 3 EMS, 4 DOT, and 1 roadway service technician. So that's normally towing and recovery, I think, leads the way, but that's a lot of cases for our volunteers, reserves, auxiliary, crossing guards, and law enforcement officers who are out there. So there were 4 motorcycle crashes in 2024. This is our third category. We have vehicle struck by, now motor crashes. 1 officer was involved in an escort. And if you've listened to me before talk about motorcycles, this is one of the most common circumstances where officers on motorcycles are handling escorts. They are moving ahead of the line of cars during the parade, or going to the internment, or whatever they are, to cut and pull their traffic. And very often they're moving along the sides of these vehicles or coming into intersections, and you have crashes. And this is for escorts for parades, funerals, VIPs, whatever you might do an escort for. And it's a very common circumstance when we have crashes involving escorts. So it's something for, I think, trainers to be aware and motor officers to think about when they're doing that. 1 officer was hit head on by a vehicle that actually was trying to pass a vehicle and struck him as he came into the oncoming lane. 1 officer was struck by a speeding vehicle. And then another was struck as a vehicle pulled out of a a garage sort of alleyway and crashed into that officer. So for NHTSA, and for everyone's information, and I actually should have a red, I should have a red circle around Region 4 because Region 6 and Region 4 both have 11 law enforcement traffic fatalities each. The state of Texas leads the nation with 9 traffic-related fatalities for 2024. That's very high. But if you think about these two regions, one, the Region 6, Region 6, as well as Region 4, they make up almost 46% of all the crashes that occurred in the United States in those two regions. That's, those are big regions, though, particularly Texas. Obviously, it's a huge state. But Regions 4 and 6 seem to be the two regions that are constantly sort of leading the way, if you will. So one of the things I started doing this year, and I did last year, but I did it even better this year, was to start pulling in more information about injury crashes, right? And crashes involving law enforcement. I don't know if you recall, we had Emily from the Sun-Times on a couple of webinars ago who talked about her investigation tracking the increase in law enforcement crashes. She also tracked the increase in at-fault law enforcement crashes by officers and deputies and such. And I think it behooves us to want to look at this problem. And again, just like we're trying to avoid fatals, these injury crashes take a huge toll on the individuals who are injured, on the agency that loses that officer, as well as the equipment and even the public perception tied to all of this. So I want to give you a little bit of data on the research that I did from 2024 from all of these news reports that as I sifted through all of them and had set up alerts, I pulled out some details. Out of what I found, in my spreadsheet, I had probably over 315 cases that I copied the link to and put in that spreadsheet and then made notes on. But out of that, 262 were cases that involved an injury. And then out of those 262 cases, there were a total of 291 police officers injured. Many of the cases had multiple injuries. The breakout of those crashes were there were 181 injury collisions. There were 10 motorcycle crashes that I found reported, 58 struck by injury cases that I found, and 5 cases of officers who were injured deploying tire deflation devices. And in 2 of those cases, they were struck and injured by fellow officers. So they weren't killed, they were injured. And a lot of these cases involved officers who are, at this point, I think probably still in critical condition or hopefully making their way back. But we've featured videos on officers who've survived crashes before. And one of our first videos was an officer who was not able to make it back to work because of the traumatic brain injury that she suffered when she was struck. So we cannot ignore the injuries, and I'm doing my best to really get my arms around what the data looks like as best I can for injuries. And again, by no means am I an academician. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a scholar. Just a flatfoot who's trying to work with some numbers, right? Total of 291 injuries that I found, right? So I really think that's times 2 for the nation, meaning I maybe only got 50% of the crashes that were out there that I happen to be able to find through all the news sources that I dove into. So, that's over 500, right? That's a lot. It's probably a lot more than that. I found that in my cases, 37 of the drivers were immediately confirmed to be impaired. 11 of these cases involved wrong way drivers. And we just had a case, by the way, right now for 2025, we have 3 cases. One came in yesterday from Texas, and it was a wrong way driver who I believe was interdicted by an officer from a Texas municipal agency who smashed his cruiser into this wrong way driver who was fleeing other officers. Wrong way crashes is something we're starting to look at. 69 of all these cases, right? So I said we found 262 cases, and then 181 of them involves a traffic collision. Of that 181, 69 involved pursuits. So 69 pursuits were involved in these crashes. And you've heard me mention this before, and I've got another slide on it. 14 of these pursuits involved stolen police cars. And again, I really think I'm probably only getting 50% of the stories that are out there. I bet you it's twice as many pursuits that went behind police vehicles that were stolen, or as you'll hear me mention in a minute, other public safety vehicles. In all of those injuries, I was able to see that there were at least 38 of those, and that's, again, that number's way low for the crashes. I just don't get the details on the injury crashes. But from what I was able to discern or get from the news reports or gather, at least 38 of them involve violations of the slow down and move over law of that state. So again, not scientific. And here's just another shot. I had this up in another presentation I did because it had just happened in November. Florida, 4 sheriff deputy cruisers were just destroyed by this drunk guy. They were on the scene of I think it was a stop, or it might have been a crash. And 3, if not 4, of their cruisers were damaged severely by a guy who just drove right into the back of all of them as they were on a stop on the right lane of a roadway in Florida, striking all of them, injuring a couple of the deputies there. And it happened a lot in November and October. For whatever, these things always seem to come in bunches. I came across several of these similar types of crashes in Ohio. I think another one in Florida. And another state where these multiple vehicles, police vehicles, are struck by another impaired individual who comes flying into either a crash scene or a stop. One of them was a felony stop. They were making a felony stop, and another guy came crashing in behind them. So it's dangerous out there, and these are some of the things we've really got to address to make it safer for our officers. I mentioned the stolen police vehicles. Some of the circumstances were handcuffed suspects, right? Getting out of the handcuffs, diving through that little window, and getting in control of that car. A couple were foot chases where the individual chased the officer ran around to chase them, and they ran around the car and got in the car and took off. A couple of others involved suspects being questioned who jumped into a car. One was a shooting where officers got out to respond to the shooting, and the suspect got in the car. And then the most bizarre one to me was a suspect got into an occupied cruiser. There was an officer sitting in the passenger seat, and the car was running. His partner was inside, and a guy got in the driver's seat and started driving with an officer in it. So it's, these are things that I think law enforcement just needs to be aware of and see what we can do with either a certain switch to put in the car once it's there so no one can engage it, or put it into drive, or whatever it is, so we can prevent these things. Because as you've heard me say, they all lead to pursuits, right? There are guns in that car. There's ammunition in that car. There's tactical gear. There's radio gear. There's all kinds of stuff in that car, not to mention it's a marked police car that you can't have a non-law enforcement officer driving around the city in. So each one of these stolen cruisers leads to a chase, and some of those chases have ended up resulting in fatalities. So it's something for us to pay attention to. I recently did a presentation for a number of officers in California, and I put this image up. One of the other things I saw, and it's probably no different than any other year, but it's just more publicized, so I'm getting it in my feeds, are individuals using heavy equipment to escape, and in many cases, ramming police cars with heavy pieces of farm equipment, construction equipment, tractor trailers. Here in DC, we've had an ambulance stolen, and I think you probably saw the highway safety truck that was stolen in Maryland and led police on a chase. This is when they stole a tank back in the 80s, and it was down in San Diego, and you see all those cruisers behind that tank. In 2024, a huge military truck was stolen and ended up getting stuck in the sand. I put this out there just so folks are aware of it. I don't know how you're supposed to stop a tank. Eventually, that tank high-centered itself on a barrier, and San Diego officers were able to get up there and open the hatch. And I don't recall if they dispatched him there or if they were able to get him out. But the guy driving the tank stopped itself. But it's a real problem when you have buses that are stolen, heavy equipment that can bash through things. Maybe thinking about that and developing a tactical plan for some of those things might not be a bad idea. I mean, again, I don't know what you're going to do about a tank. So we always have our key topics in traffic safety. Top of the list is seatbelts. Complacency, I think that really is a problem. We all tend to get complacent, especially when driving. And we can't keep yelling at officers about stay vigilant and keep your head on a swivel and all these things. That's great, but you just can't. Your body can't do that. Even for 8 hours a shift, or if you're working 10-hour shifts, you can't. That's a really difficult thing to do. Fatigue is a huge issue. And I think it's one that needs to be addressed. I know that's really challenging given the fact that agencies are hurting for personnel. And I know that's happening here with my former agency. Guys are mandatory overtime is through the roof, and there's definitely fatigue. We've talked about tire deflation devices. Training is one thing we really want to put an emphasis on. I think if we train the way we train with our firearms, biannually, with regular EVOC training, with regular other training that can enhance skills, get rid of bad habits, that kind of thing. I think that those are really good things to help us improve our skills and reduce crashes. Right side approaches, we've said that. Body armor, again, several of the cases that I reviewed this year, officers did not have their body armor on, and it can protect you in a crash. And then being seen, meaning having visibility vests on, having lighting at a crash scene. And don't forget about the TIM principles and what that chief from Arlington, Texas was talking about, having that big, heavy blocker vehicle if you're working a crash, particularly on a highway or fast roadway or multi-lane roadway, having that heavy piece of equipment like a DOT truck or one with an attenuator or a fire truck to help interdict that inattentive driver is critical. If you recall that presentation by the chief in Arlington, one of his trucks that he takes old fire trucks and has them outfitted to be used for traffic blocking, one of his trucks was struck by a pickup truck. They have it on video. Pickup truck ran right into that thing. And if it hadn't been there doing its job, other people would have been injured. The other thing I want to mention, and I did mention it in my presentations a couple of weeks ago, I think we still have a big problem in law enforcement with alcohol use. And we've seen a couple of big stories where officers are in uniform, in marked cruisers, being arrested by other jurisdiction or their own, impaired behind the wheel. If you have a problem and a problem employee, make sure you address it. And most of those problems, everybody knows what's going on, and ignoring it is terrible. So I think that's something that, and the Safe Leo training talks about that, talks about dealing with alcohol abuse in law enforcement. So I mentioned that we've got the flash drives. We can send them out to you. It's got a new video that we made. It's a longer video, so it does require a little more attention rather than the stories we produce. This is a video that is about recommendations based on the problems that we've discussed. It's about 7 minutes long, and it covers everything from seatbelts, tire deflation devices, watching your speed. It covers the tenets of below 100, reminding everybody those basic tenets, which are geared not just towards traffic safety, but also tactical safety. But many of what they are, of those 5 tenets, they're directly related to traffic safety. So if you can go on our website, same instructions as before, but just click on the Officer Safety and Wellness tab, and then click on the featured video for NHTSA. And there is this video we put together that we filmed in DC. The CEO of the Memorial Fund, Bill Alexander, is there and introduces it. And it is really, if nothing more, it is a video that is trying to prime people to focus more on training and roadway safety for law enforcement. That's it. So if you may or may not recall, in 2022, we held a traffic safety summit here in DC. We are working on putting another one together again. This is not going to be a summit the way the last one was. That last one was really focused on talking about the problems, letting everybody know what we're seeing in the problems, and largely talking about struck by crashes. That was part of the focus of that. And we had some pretty high level folks here who supported that effort. And we're looking to maybe do that again, but it will be more of a, rather than a summit, I'm calling it a forum, but we want to push out. Everybody knows what the problems are. Let's start pushing the solutions and recommendations out to the field so people can start acting on them, right? making this actionable, lighting a fire under some folks to get them to see that this is a problem. It's a problem that affects safety, health, finances, equipment, resources, all of that. It's a problem that if we can reduce these crashes, we save a whole bunch of stuff, lives, injuries, and money. So that's really where we're going. We don't have a date yet. I will share that with you. We're still working on when the exact date of that is going to be. So here's my email. If you need a minute to take that down and want to request a flash drive, do that. There's our website, www.nleomf.org. Please visit it and avail yourself of all the resources that are on our website. I know lots of places have websites. I get it. I know there are a lot of places that, all kinds of different folks who have information on there with advice and guides and training and videos and all that. But I would ask you that you give ours a look, and I think they're right in the vein of what we've been talking about for all these many years. So let me see if we have some questions. Hang on one sec. Let's see what we've got. Is Safe Leo only for law enforcement officers, or can other first responders attend? So the quick answer is yes, it is only for law enforcement officers. It's designed especially for law enforcement officers. However, we have had fire department employees, firefighters in some of the trainings, and other public safety officials in those trainings. But it has been specifically designed for what law enforcement officers face that is unique to their occupation in terms of the shift work, the dangers, the use of force, and of course the huge negative perception of law enforcement in the country. Are pit maneuvers, this is the next question, are pit maneuvers considered as crashes? That's a great question. Most do result in damage to both vehicles. So I was watching, going through my news feeds, I guess it was just yesterday, and there was a pit maneuver on a fleeing vehicle. I'm trying to remember where it was. And there was damage to the patrol car, the front right fender, because he came up on the driver's side of the vehicle and pit him. I would call it a crash. Anytime a vehicle intentionally or otherwise collides with another vehicle, it's a crash. So I imagine on that agency, they would do a crash report and or what we call the PD 43. That's the right number. That's documenting damage. So yeah, I would think it probably is a crash. The last question is a distinction made between on-duty law enforcement crashes and off-duty crashes? How many agencies issue take-home vehicles to their personnel and may use them for travel to court, gym, or other? Yeah, that's a good question as well. So for us at the Memorial Fund, I had a marked take-home vehicle for years. And if I was coming and going and got into a fatal crash, because I represent law enforcement, the Memorial Fund believes that marked cruiser serves as a deterrent, whether it is on duty or off duty. They consider that line of duty. So here at the Memorial Fund, we call it coming and going. And yeah, if they're out running an errand, but they're still in their parked car, marked cruiser, we would consider that a line of duty death, even if it was off duty. How many agencies do that? I don't know. I know that in special circumstances for my agency, which is a city agency, and they generally did not give folks marked take-home cars. I got one because of special circumstances, even though I lived in Maryland. And our motormen, all of the Metropolitan Police motormen, they take their motors home and come back and forth. So if you're in a motor crash to and from, it would be a line of duty injury and line of duty death if they died. But I do know that many county agencies, for example, Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, they have take-home cars. Prince George's County, Maryland, where I live, an adjacent county, they have take-home cars. I don't know about smaller counties like Alexandria. I know there are many sheriff agencies that have their deputies all have take-home cars. And if you drive throughout the country, you'll see them parked in driveways. And clearly the deputies, live there and they get on the air from their home, and I guess they're on the clock. But how many in the United States, I really don't know. I would speculate the more rural you get, the more common it'll be to have a take-home car. One thing I have noticed, more and more unmarked vehicles. They have lights in them, but they're unmarked. And if you watch the news and see things, there seem to be a lot of unmarked pickups, unmarked Explorers and things like that. And that was new to me, only in that if you were a detective, you had an unmarked car. If you were a commander or a chief, generally you could have an unmarked car. But most of the other vehicles, particularly those that are responding to crimes, unless it's a street unit, would all be marked units. But anyway, that's just something that I've noticed. Is that it, Anna? We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you guys for your questions. I think in our next webinar, our next quarter, we'll of course cover the numbers. And before I forget, we've had 3 fatalities this year already. If I didn't mention that, 1 in each category: a vehicle crash, a struck by, and a single vehicle. We've had 3 fatal crashes already this year. So thank you for your time. Again, if anybody has anybody they'd like to see up here, or has some information or something they'd like to invite as a guest to share that, that would be great. I think one of the things we'd like to do is to have a presentation on a case study. If anybody has any ideas about that, please share that with me. I think it would be interesting to hear from somebody to walk us through one of these fatal investigations, so we all understand what's involved. Because when I get these packets, I mean, they're serving search warrants on phones now. They're pulling the modules on these cars. They're reviewing traffic camera footage. There's a lot of technology that's now going in to support these investigations, and they're making conclusions from them. So I think it might be good for all of us, particularly for those of us who've been out of the game for a few years, to really understand what agencies are doing to investigate these fatal crashes. Everybody be safe, and thank you very much for your time.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.